Hey everybody, I'm Rosalyn Dennett, and welcome to Season 4 of Refocus. Each episode, I'm joined by incredible guests from all areas of the music industry for real and informative conversations with a focus on folk. Hello and welcome to Refocus. Our guest today is Troy Greencorn. Troy spent much of his career working in culture-based economic and tourism-based community development. He is also the founder and producer of the Stan Rogers Folk Festival, now in its 28th year. Stanfest, as it has come to be known, is an international songwriters festival that presents a roster of over 50 accomplished artists and acts from a wide range of genres. The event is hosted annually in Canso, Nova Scotia. Troy is also the executive director of the deCoste Performing Arts Centre in Pictou, Nova Scotia, a 400-seat facility which presents over 100 events each year. Troy, welcome. How are you doing?
Great, Rosalyn. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. So we're continuing what we're calling culture and climate conversations with this chat. And I've been really excited to get to speak with you in this context because you're a bit of a rabble-rouser. I'm going to call you an instigator in the climate conversations. And I feel like you've inspired a lot of, what we're doing at Folk Canada in response to climate, and really have started this really interesting conversation amongst festivals in response to the climate crisis. I'm wondering if you can take us back to what kind of inspired you to start taking action when it comes to climate.
Sure. Well, I guess that we unfortunately have too much experience dealing with extreme climate. So the festival, for folks not familiar with Nova Scotia geography, is located in northeastern Nova Scotia. And actually, I've always been told it's the most northeasterly point on mainland North America, which means this community is surrounded on three sides by the Atlantic Ocean. So even for Nova Scotia, we have really variable climate. And I guess, to put it in perspective, in the past 10 years, we have had three major rainouts, which I define as at least 2 days of the 3 days of show canceling rain. So we've had three rainouts, a complete cancellation due to a hurricane that popped in the forecast 4 days out from the event. So that's four major weather events, and then 2 pandemic years. So there's 6 out of 10 festivals that have had major external kind of impacts. So really, that's our experience. And I've been sitting around national festival tables for decades now. And in 2023, it was shocking to sit around. Actually, it was around a RAD table, and there was about 20 of us. And for folks who don't know, RAD is the Western Roots Artistic Directors. But it was shocking, normally in any given year, there's 2 or 3 events across the country that have, experienced a real climate anomaly. But in 2023, it seemed like there were 20 or more. And it was rain, it was wind, it was hail, it was forest fires. It was a shocking number of festivals impacted by forest fires. And I remember looking around the table and just seeing the emotion in everybody's eyes. And it was like this really abrupt realization that this factor that was on our radar and we all knew was sort of gradually coming towards us was coming much quicker than we expected. For us in 2023, our weekend, Nova Scotia had 8 or 9 deaths due to flash flooding. And in my lifetime, I've never heard of that. Flash flooding in downtown Halifax. And here we are with thousands of people on a folk festival site dealing with that. So I believe it's by far the biggest issue that we all face. All folk festivals across the country, across the continent, around the world, certainly outdoor festivals. It's this enormous common challenge. And I think government is aware of it. And I think government has opened a dialogue in some cases, but I don't feel it's being taken seriously enough. I don't think it's really progressed to the point where there are actual programs, or a festival could have a major climate incident and cease to exist because there aren't programs there to assist in that situation at this point.
I wanted to follow up by getting an idea, if you could shine a bit of a light on kind of what the impact is. If you lose 2 days of programming, or you have to like shut down for the weekend, like what is the impact on the organization? And you can talk about it in terms of Stanfest or just, in general as a festival. What does that look like for you as an organization?
The impacts are many and, multi-level. The biggest immediate impact is at the gate, and I think this is even more acute for urban festivals where the audience gets up every day and decides, okay, is it a nice day? Am I going to go to the site? An event like ours, people have committed. Most of them have traveled and they're on site camping. But certainly we all rely on day trippers. So that's the first impact. And then what we've experienced across all of our revenues, you just see a major impact right off the top. And then it just goes from there. In each of the cases where we've had extreme weather, we've had all kinds of site damage that gets done, and we're talking tens of thousands of dollars. In 2023, our entire main field, we weren't really able to access it at all. And it's a municipal area. But what you discover in those extreme rain situations, when a month of rain falls in a couple hours, is the drainage systems just aren't built for that. So a field just becomes waterlogged. So it's just heartbreaking to look at your main stage with $50,000 worth of production and it's not in use for 2 days and you're moving shows to other venues. We've been fortunate. We have a full-scale hockey arena on our site. So in an extreme weather situation, we can kind of move inside, keep the show going, but certainly it's not the same.
And then do you see a ripple effect after a catastrophic year? Like after a year where you have these incidences, the next year, do people bounce back and it's like nothing happened? Or do you see ripple effects from it?
Yeah, I believe there is certainly a ripple effect. We're lucky that we're going into our 28th year. So we have a fairly large portion of our audience that we like to refer to as lifers. These are people who've attended 20 or more of 28 festivals. And they're very resilient. They keep coming back. And in fact, I'm often blown away by how resilient they are. But, in any given year, we may have 10 to 15, maybe 20% of our audience that are coming for the first time. And if your first experience is attending an event where half of the shows didn't happen and the ones that did were confusing, array of rescheduled and relocated shows, or if you spend 3 days in a wet tent, the experience isn't great. And potentially we've lost that opportunity to create a new long-term customer. I believe a lot of festivals across the country, certainly coming through the decade that we just have, don't have huge reserves. There's not a major cushion there. So when a weather event has a couple $100,000 impact, that can be a really dire situation. It certainly has been for us numerous times over the years. And we have wonderful support from our funding partners. The event is a major economic driver, a major tourism driver. So we've always been able to kind of access emergency funding. But still, that kind of just barely gets you through. And you carry that weight sometimes for 3 to 5 years. And you just hope that you don't get hit by another weather incident during that time.
And, you mentioned that there's ways that festivals could receive more support. In your dream scenario, or in your easily actionable scenario, what are the things that can be put in place? Are there policy changes? What can happen? How can festivals be more supported to gain some resiliency through this?
I've had lots of conversations with my colleagues and also have had opportunity to talk, with the various funders over the years. And there's some real champions, as you know. And I've kind of come to a line of thinking where I feel like there should be maybe a 3-stage sort of program created. And stage 1 would be funding available to organizations to do a climate action plan. So what does that mean? To me, that means looking at your event and determining what your level of vulnerability is and what you could do to reduce that level of vulnerability. And the reason this kind of came to mind for me is because we've had to do this without any support. We've had to do it ourselves. So part 1 is a planning piece. And, over the years, our funders have nudged us as organizations to do work on governance, to do work on EDI, to do work on other important areas by providing some support. So part 1 is planning. And then I think that needs to be followed up with project funding. Mm-hmm. So if a festival, for example, determines, okay, our site has major drainage issues and it's going to cost $100,000 to improve the drainage of that site. It would be wonderful if our provincial funders and or our federal funders like Heritage would share in those projects. It might be a third with the festival, but it's no good to have a planning program if there's not an implementation program. And then I think, ultimately part 3 of this continuum is an emergency fund. And it kind of sounds extreme and radical, and it's something we've never thought about really in our sector. I've never heard it discussed, but I know that it does exist in many other sectors, whether it's farming or the fishery, and this might be a fund where the provinces and the federal government partner on it. In some discussions, there's even been talk about events contributing to it. But really, it's about how do we prevent an event that, let's say is 30 years old like ours, ceasing to exist because of a $100,000 hit to revenue. There should be an emergency fund. So really, I guess those are the 3 things that I've been thinking about and sharing with our government, our government funders every chance I get.
I mean, what does it mean for the community, for the province, if the festival ceases to exist? Like if you guys, with your experience and your audience and your trust from the community, can make it work, the likeliness of, somebody being able to come up and pick that up and, start up something new in that same scenario with the same conditions is unlikely. What kind of impact, what happens if the festivals can't do it, can't make it through a catastrophic event?
Yeah, well, 15 years ago, we probably would have thought and felt that, our signature festivals across the country were forever. And we've seen, shockingly, that's not the case. We've seen how fragile and vulnerable, some of these major festivals are. In the case of Stanfest, and it's a very small festival in comparison to others across the country, we just had an economic impact assessment done last year, and it's about a $3 million direct impact in that region each year. And I would say that's wonderful, but I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. I think the real impact of the event is what it's done culturally. There's 1,000 artists from around the world that have performed in one of Nova Scotia's smallest, most remote and economically challenged communities. The impact of that is impossible to quantify, but it's changed lives. It's inspired careers. People have moved to the community because of the festival. So to think that could be wiped out by a major climate event is shocking, but it's real. As I say, in 10 years, we've had 4 major weather impacted years and 2 pandemic years. It's almost incredible that we're having this conversation, to be totally honest. That's how real the situation is.
We're talking about what festivals can do, what funders can do, but is there ways for the community to step up in this way and show support or affect any sort of positive change there?
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick story, and then I can talk about what we're doing to improve our resilience in this situation. So the story happens in 2014 when we discover on the Wednesday morning that we have to cancel a folk festival. And it's because on Tuesday, there's a weather alert that there's a hurricane coming at Nova Scotia, and the Canso area is the impact zone. This is a category 3 or a category 4 hurricane. And so many people have asked me, how did you make that decision? That must have been the toughest decision you've ever made. And what I always say is it was actually the easiest decision because there was really only one choice. But the next 10 decisions were the toughest decisions I've ever made. How do you do that? There was a dozen European artists in the air at that point. There's 800 people in the campground. We're 4 days out. The site has been built for a week. And how do you take something that took 2 weeks to build and tear it all down? Anyway, so one of the things we had to decide was, what do we do about refunds? And in that moment, you're thinking about how do we survive this? But you're also thinking about how do we take care of our patrons? Because that's part of surviving this. So we quickly made a decision that we had to offer refunds, but we also communicated 2 other options in our news release. And the other 2 options were that we proposed folks consider deferring their ticket to the next year or donating it, to help us through the crisis. And in the end, nearly 70% of our audience either donated or deferred.
Wow.
Which there couldn't be any better show of support, or demonstration of what the event meant to people. But, Our audience is smart and they knew, okay, this organization is on the ropes.
Mm.
And this is an extreme situation beyond what anybody could ever comprehend. So there was a couple hours after the decision was made where I felt like, I've just spent nearly 20 years of my life, as have a lot of other people, building something that's now gone because there is no way to recover. And within a couple hours, as these messages kept coming in, and our funders were calling us to say, look, you've made the right decision. If you act based on safety, nobody can really ever fault you on that. We had donors jump in, and we even had other major festivals across the country make donations. So it was this incredible
Wow.
outpouring of support. But that's not something that one can depend on. And I believe that was in the old days when it
Mm.
was an incredible anomaly. That's not possible when it's 20 events across the country. So flash forward to what are we doing now? So over the last 2 years, we've been preparing a new strategic plan for the next 5 years. And certainly the biggest factor that we're dealing with is climate. And we've embraced the fact that, it's our single biggest risk. We need to manage it. So we're in the process of making a major change to our model. And this can be a really complicated discussion, or you can really simplify it. And what that means to us is we need to get some of our stages indoors. So what we're creating is a fairly unique hybrid kind of model. So
Mhm.
across the country, there are many site-based folk festivals, and there are certainly a growing number of distributed festivals. And what we're creating is a new model that's actually both. So last year was the first year where we had, in the 3 days leading into the festival, we had 8 shows and 6 venues. This year, I believe it's 9 shows and eight venues, and it's growing. So that was step one, and the region is very excited because the duration has now been extended, the
Mhm.
geographic footprint has been expanded, and it's weather resilient. In
Mhm.
most cases, unless we're talking power outages or those sort of things, the shows go on. Now, this year, we're sort of moving into stage 2 of this model, which is actually taking a stage or 2 or 3 off the site into facilities in the community. And the goal ultimately is that when there is extreme weather, most of the show can still happen. So there's not that financial hit. So, like we've moved on from talking about it to actually making major changes. And on one hand, it's terrifying at year 28 to be making these kind of changes. But I think it's also exciting us and inspiring us. And
Mhm.
it's a new challenge, but it's just so practical. And I think if we and other festivals put our head in the sand, we're not really doing our community justice or our event justice. So that's the direction we're heading. And the reaction has been wonderful. Like every festival needs to be really deliberate and active at engaging their community and re-engaging their community.
Mm.
And because we've steered in this direction, mostly from a climate change perspective, there are 8 or 9 new communities that now feel they have ownership of a piece of the festival. And we've been able to support this activity to some degree through our existing funding
Mhm.
sources, but there wasn't a program there specifically to help us do this,
Mm.
not to help us plan it, not to do those drainage projects or to do all the marketing that's required to make a major pivot.
Mhm. Yeah, I imagine there's like community consultation. There's just the facilitation of changing your strategic plan and being able to come up with these alternatives. All this stuff takes resources. And yeah, I'm wondering if, I guess, with when you're dealing with the community at a certain point, the community is there to help out and to pitch in during these events. And I imagine that after a certain point, they're expecting something to change, right? And you guys have implemented this massive organizational change within the festival. I'm wondering if you have some advice for other organizations that maybe haven't faced this challenge head on yet. There's a lot of provinces with like just all the festivals within a region that are just starting to, I think, feel some extra pressure from climate change and, that they maybe haven't felt before. So, what would be your advice for these organizations that are starting to come around to realizing that they have to start making some changes?
I think there's sort of a direct line of action which every festival has to take, which is, kind of doing what we've been doing. and looking at their event and where those vulnerabilities are and what they can do. And for some festivals, it might be changing to a different type of tent that's more weather resilient over stage. For many, it's site improvements. For some, it's emergency planning. So on a direct level, I think every festival has to do that. Even if there isn't support, it's really about survival. For our various funding partners, I think it really is time to walk the talk. It's time for there to be a national gathering where all the provinces and heritage come together and decide, okay, what is it? What does it look like? Is it a 3-part program like this crazy guy in Nova Scotia is going on about? Or is it something different than that? But it's not good enough for there to be nothing. And I think, from organizing conferences, we're still in that stage where every year we have a discussion and everybody comes together and everybody agrees how big of an issue it is, but there's not enough change from one year to the next. By now, a new program should be announced. I think when we embrace it, there's going to be all kinds of wonderful innovation across the country. I think back to the COVID crisis and how so many of us, came up with these incredible models to keep the shows happening, whether that was online or spaced or whatever it may be. But really, I think there needs to be a national summit, and whether that is a standalone event or whether it's, connected to another major national event, it really has to go to that level. And I don't know how we instigate that. I guess, there's a role for organizations like Folk Canada as, representatives of the sector. But I think it's also each of us, advocating for that with our provincial MLAs and our federal MPs. In our economy, the strong survive, and those sectors that advocate strongly and advocate well get what they need. And it's a major challenge that we have to navigate.
Can regular citizens of the world share in that advocacy? If somebody is listening in and going like, okay, I'm not a festival organizer, but I want to support and I want to help to see the festival in my community keep going. Is there a way for them to add their voice and show support or to engage in some sort of action that would be helpful?
Well, I often, when I'm asked a question like that, I think back to one of my earliest and biggest mentors, Mitch Podolik. And Mitch would say, buy a goddamn ticket.
Probably even more colorful language than that.
Get off the bench. I think that's the most basic level that you can support your festival, or perhaps it's volunteering. Almost anywhere in Canada, you can be part of a festival and it can be very accessible through volunteering. Certainly if folks have a channel to speak with their elected representatives, it would be a wonderful help. It takes repetition to be heard because there are so many issues and so many sectors. And I think it gets overlooked what the incredible economic and cultural impact is of these events. I always thought it would be amazing if we did a national combination of economic impact numbers. It would be a shocking number, but having that number would perhaps get us the audience we need for change.
Yeah, we just went through our federal election and you don't even have to pick up a phone. They'll come right to your door and ask you what you're interested in, what are the issues that you're voting on that you care about. And yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity as audience or fans or citizens of our communities, as simple as just saying like, I care about arts and culture, or I care about live music. I care about letting folks know that it's on your priority list and you're going to vote based on that priority list.
Yeah, I think, it has to be said that, it's not that we're doing a bad job. I think all of us as festivals are advocating and doing a good job in our regions. And our funding partners have been tremendous. I look at the COVID crisis and I remember the early days thinking, how can we ever survive this? Like, we're in the gathering business. And what we thought was impossible is now law. We can't gather, and through incredible support from our provincial and federal partners, we all came through that. And I believe that can happen again around climate, and so many organizations have done great advocacy on our behalf. Folk Canada, the Canadian Live Music Association, the Provincial Music Industry Association, CCMA. It was a major victory to get through that crisis and come out perhaps even stronger, certainly more unified and connected. And I think we came out of that with government having a better understanding of why the sector is important and what the actual value is, economic and otherwise.
So now, looking ahead, you have a festival coming up this summer. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're looking forward to for Stanfest 2025?
Yeah, so our event happens in late July. And normally I would be saying July 25 to 27. But as I mentioned, we're now in year 2 of being a week-long event. So it's July 21st to 27 in 9 communities.
Wow.
Yeah, so super excited about that. We're going through a strategic planning process, sort of the final step in our strategic planning process, which is engaging our 30 crew leaders to kind of provide input into that plan. So we have a summit coming up to do that. We're solidly embracing succession planning with our board, with our staff. We've brought on a new artistic director in the past couple of years, Steve McIntyre.
Lovely fellow.
Many will have met Steve, and he's doing incredible, and he's booked an incredible festival this year. So, certainly would encourage folks to take a look at stanfest.com. Incredible lineup and a really interesting model. And it takes place, I'm more than a little bit biased, but it takes place in the most beautiful part of Canada and the most incredible little community, which is actually my hometown. It's pretty incredible to look back at what's been created in this little community. And the whole region is super engaged and proud of the event. Yeah, so buy early, buy often.
Yes. Get your tickets now if you don't have them already. And definitely go check out the lineup. I think, Stanfest has continually had, such an impressive lineup of artists. It's been a real treat to see how the programming's evolved. Troy, thanks so much for the conversation. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
That's all for this episode, friends. The Refocus podcast is an original production by Folk Canada. Find out more by heading to folkcanada.com/refocus. That's REFOLKUS. The podcast is produced by Kayla Nizon and Rosalyn Dennett and mixed by Jordan Moore at the Pod Cabin. The opening theme is written and performed by King Cardiac, and the artwork is by Jamie Karn. Please give us a download, subscribe, rate, and review to let us know you care, and follow us at folk_Canada on Instagram to submit your questions.